"Look at her," someone said, not even bothering to lower their voice. The one even the moon forgot to mark. The words didn't echo. They settled, heavy and deliberate, into the vast chamber like smoke that refused to rise. Lillian Hayes stood at the edge of the grand hall, just inside the threshold where polished stone met the worn soles of those who were never meant to belong. The chandeliers above cast a warm amber glow across the room, catching on crystal glasses, gold-threaded coats, and the sharp, assessing eyes of every alpha present. The air smelled faintly of aged whiskey, burning cedarwood, and something deeper, something instinctive, like dominance pressed into breath itself. She kept her hands folded in front of her, fingers still, though she could feel the tremor beneath her skin, a quiet rebellion her body refused to show. Around her, laughter rose and fell in waves, not cruel enough to be called an attack, but not kind enough to ignore. It was the kind of laughter meant to remind someone exactly where they stood, or rather, where they didn't. Lillian's dress was simple, a faded gray that blended too easily into the stone walls behind her, the fabric slightly loose at the sleeves where it had been mended more than once. She had chosen it on purpose. It made her easier to overlook. Invisible was safer. Invisible didn't get called forward. But tonight, invisibility had failed her. "You," a voice called, sharp enough to cut through the layered conversations. Heads turned, not in surprise, but in expectation, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Lillian lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes meeting the speaker only for a fraction of a second before dropping again, just as she had been taught. Respect was survival. Step forward. There was no hesitation in the command. The space between her and the center of the room stretched longer than it should have, every step measured, every movement watched. She could feel it, the weight of attention, the quiet shift as conversations paused, as interest sharpened. One of the alphas nearest the center tilted his head slightly, studying her like one might examine something unfamiliar, something that didn't quite fit. "This is the one," another voice murmured, amusement threading through the words. "The scentless Omega?" A few low chuckles followed. Lillian stopped where the light fell brightest, the warmth of it brushing her face, though it did nothing to ease the chill that had settled beneath her ribs. She kept her posture straight, shoulders aligned, chin neither lifted nor lowered too far. Balanced, controlled, safe. "Tell me," the first alpha continued, circling her slowly, boots tapping softly against the polished floor. "Do you always stand so quietly, or is it only when you're surrounded by those above you?" The question wasn't meant to be answered. It hung there, a performance rather than an inquiry. Lillian felt the shift of air as he moved behind her, the subtle pressure of presence that came with power. It was instinct, more than fear, that urged her to shrink, to make herself smaller. But she didn't. Not completely. Her fingers curled slightly against her palm, nails pressing just enough to anchor her. She had learned that much, how to hold herself together when everything else tried to pull her apart. "I asked you a question." His voice was closer now, lower. She drew in a breath, steady, quiet. "I stand where I'm placed," she said, her tone soft but clear, the words measured carefully so they wouldn't break. Another ripple of sound moved through the room, this time sharper, more interested. Not because of what she said, but because she had said anything at all. The alpha in front of her paused, then gave a small, almost thoughtful smile, as if she had confirmed something for him. "And who placed you here?" he asked. Lillian didn't answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because some answers only invited more questions, and questions, in a room like this, were rarely given gently. For a moment, there was only silence. Not empty, but waiting. Then someone laughed again, louder this time, and the tension shifted just enough to make the moment feel like entertainment instead of judgment. But Lillian could still feel it, the undercurrent, the awareness, the sense that something had begun, even if no one had named it yet. She lowered her gaze once more, breathing slow, steady, as if the ground beneath her feet was still solid, as if she belonged exactly where she stood, even while every instinct in the room insisted she didn't. The laughter did not fade. It changed. It sharpened, taking on a rhythm that circled her like a slow-moving current, testing the edges of her composure. Lillian kept her eyes lowered, but she was no longer unseen. That was the difference. Before, she had existed at the edges, a shadow that moved quietly between tables, unnoticed unless something was needed. Now, she stood at the center of the room, and every glance carried weight. Not curiosity, not kindness. Assessment. A servant stepped forward with a silver tray, the faint clink of glass against glass cutting through the noise. The man who had circled her reached for one of the crystal tumblers, swirling the amber liquid inside before pausing, his attention drifting back to her, as if she were an unfinished thought. "If you stand where you are placed," he said slowly, "then let us see how well you hold your place." He extended the glass toward her, not as an offering, but as a test. The meaning was clear even before anyone spoke. Omegas did not serve alphas in the center of the council floor. Not like this. Not under scrutiny. This was not about service. This was about display. Lillian lifted her gaze just enough to see the glass, the faint reflection of candlelight rippling across its surface. For a brief second, her hand did not move. Not out of refusal, but because she understood what this moment was meant to become. A choice disguised as obedience. Around her, the room grew quieter, the kind of silence that leaned forward, waiting. Then she stepped closer. Her fingers closed gently around the base of the glass, careful, steady, as if the smallest tremor might confirm what they already believed about her. She turned, following the unspoken direction of expectation, and extended the drink toward another alpha seated nearby. He did not take it immediately. Instead, he leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing with faint amusement, as if watching a performance unfold exactly as planned. "Higher," he said. "If you are going to serve at least make it worth watching." A few voices murmured in agreement. Lillian raised her arm slightly, adjusting the angle, the muscles in her shoulder tightening under the strain of holding still. The glass hovered between them, a fragile balance of expectation and control. For a moment, it seemed like it would end there. A small humiliation, a quiet reminder. Then the seated alpha finally reached out. His fingers brushed the rim of the glass, but instead of taking it, he let his hand linger just long enough to tilt it slightly. The liquid shifted, catching the light as it moved too close to the edge. Not spilled, not quite, but close enough that a ripple of laughter moved through the room again, softer this time, more satisfied. Lillian adjusted her grip instantly, correcting the balance before a single drop could fall. Her movements were precise, almost instinctive. She had learned to anticipate small cruelties, the subtle ways people tested limits without ever crossing a line that could be named. The alpha's lips curved faintly. "Careful," he said, finally taking the glass from her hand. "You would not want to make a mess in front of so many important eyes." She stepped back immediately, returning her hands to their place in front of her, fingers folding over each other to hide the faint tremor that had begun to return. The moment could have ended there. It should have. But something in the room had shifted, and the attention had not moved on. Another voice spoke from across the hall, deeper, edged with interest rather than amusement. "Strange," it said. She did not flinch. The words carried farther than the others had, not because they were louder, but because they were different. Not mocking, observing. Lillian felt it then, before she saw it. A presence that did not blend into the noise of the room. It did not demand attention. It altered it. Slowly, without lifting her head fully, she allowed her gaze to shift just enough to follow the direction of that voice. In the far corner of the hall, partially shadowed by the tall columns that framed the chamber, a man stood apart from the others. His posture was still, almost effortless, as if he did not need to move to be noticed. He held no glass, spoke no further words, yet the space around him felt quieter, controlled. Lillian looked away quickly, her breath catching for the smallest fraction of a second before she steadied it again. She did not know why that moment felt different, only that it did. And somewhere beneath the surface of the room's carefully crafted order, something unseen had begun to shift. "Say something again." A voice called from somewhere behind her, lighter than the others, but edged with challenge. "Or did that take everything you had?" The room shifted subtly, attention tightening once more around Lillian, as if the moment before had not been enough, as if silence itself had become another flaw to examine. She did not turn immediately. She had learned that turning too fast invited more, that reacting too visibly made them lean closer, dig deeper. Instead, she let a single breath settle in her chest, slow and measured, before she lifted her gaze just enough to acknowledge the speaker without offering him the full weight of her attention. "I answered what was asked," she said, her voice even, neither raised nor withdrawn. It was not defiance. It was not submission. It simply existed. That, more than anything, seemed to stir something in the room. A few alphas exchanged glances, not amused this time, but thoughtful in a way that carried a different kind of edge. "You answered carefully," the man replied, stepping closer into the light. He was taller than most, broad-shouldered, his presence filling the space in a way that made others instinctively shift to give him room. Careful can look a lot like hiding. Lillian felt the words settle against her, not striking, but pressing, testing the boundaries of what she would allow. Around them, the air seemed to still again, the low hum of conversation fading into something quieter, more focused. This was no longer casual entertainment. It was becoming something else. "Or it can look like knowing where you stand," she replied, her tone unchanged, though her fingers tightened briefly before relaxing again. The man studied her, his gaze sharpening, searching for something beneath the surface of her composure. Then, slowly, a smile curved at the corner of his mouth. "And where do you think that is?" he asked. The question hung there, heavier than the others had been. Not because of its words, but because of what it implied. Lillian could feel it, the expectation, the unspoken demand that she define herself within the lines they had already drawn for her. She lowered her gaze again, not in surrender, but in restraint. There were answers that would satisfy them, and there were answers that would not. She chose neither. "Here," she said quietly. It was a simple word. Too simple, perhaps, but it did not place her beneath them. It did not elevate her above them. It simply refused to agree to the scale they had set. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then a soft exhale of laughter slipped from someone nearby, but it lacked the earlier confidence. It was uncertain, as if the rhythm had been disrupted in a way they could not quite name. The tall alpha's smile faded, not entirely, but enough to reveal something more measured beneath it. "Interesting," he murmured, though whether it was approval or warning remained unclear. He stepped back, just slightly, as if conceding the space without fully releasing control of it. And that was when it happened. Not loud, not dramatic. A glass somewhere on the far side of the room was set down a little too firmly, the sound sharp enough to cut through the quiet. It should have been nothing, a small break in composure. But the reaction it drew was immediate and instinctive. Several alphas straightened, their attention snapping toward the source without question, without hesitation. Lillian felt it before she understood it. That same shift from before. The one that did not announce itself, but altered everything around it. She did not look right away. She had learned that much already. But the pull of it was undeniable, like a current beneath still water, steady and inescapable. When she finally allowed her gaze to move, just slightly, it was not toward the sound, but toward the space that had changed because of it. The man in the shadows had not moved much. Not in any obvious way. Yet the distance between him and the rest of the room felt different now, defined, as if an invisible line had been drawn that no one else dared to cross. His gaze was no longer distant. It was fixed, not on the alphas who had commanded the room moments before, not on the one who had questioned her. On her. Lillian's breath caught again, softer this time, barely noticeable, but enough that she felt it. There was no amusement in his expression, no open challenge. Only a quiet intensity that did not ask for attention, yet held it completely. For the first time since she had been called forward, the weight of the room did not feel like it was pressing down on her. It felt suspended, waiting, and somewhere deep beneath the surface of everything she had learned to expect, something unfamiliar stirred. Not fear, not exactly, but the sense that whatever came next would not follow the rules she had spent her entire life trying to survive. "Careful," someone muttered under their breath, though it carried farther than intended. "You are drawing attention you cannot keep." The words were not directed at her, not exactly, but they landed all the same. Lillian felt them settle against her shoulders like a quiet warning, the kind that came too late to be useful. The room had not returned to what it was before. That much was clear. Conversations had resumed, but not fully. Laughter still surfaced in places, but it was thinner now, threaded with something more alert, more aware. The balance had shifted, even if no one had named it aloud. Lillian kept her posture steady, her gaze lowered once more, but her awareness had sharpened. She could feel it, the subtle changes in movement, The way certain alphas now glanced toward the far side of the hall before speaking, the way their voices adjusted without conscious thought. Respect did not always announce itself. Sometimes it rearranged everything quietly. "You are still here," the tall alpha said again, his tone no longer openly amused, but edged with something more deliberate. He stepped closer once more, though not as casually as before. There was a measured distance now, as if he, too, had sensed something he did not fully understand. Most would have found a reason to step back by now. Lillian did not move. Not forward. Not back. "I was not dismissed," she replied, her voice calm, though softer than before, as if acknowledging the space had changed without claiming to understand it. A faint shift passed through the nearby group. Not quite approval, not quite disapproval. Something in between. The alpha studied her again, longer this time, as if recalculating. "Then perhaps you are waiting," he said. The word lingered, testing. Waiting implied expectation. Expectation implied ambition. Both were dangerous assumptions in a room like this. Lillian felt the weight of it, the subtle push to define herself again, to give them something they could place neatly within their understanding. She did not. "I am standing," she answered instead. Simple, unadorned. The response drew a quieter reaction than before, but it held longer. Not laughter, not dismissal, something closer to consideration. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then a soft clink of glass echoed again from across the room, sharper this time, more intentional. It was not an accident. That much was clear in the way the sound cut cleanly through the lingering quiet, drawing every gaze without effort. Lillian did not need to look to know where it came from. She felt it first, the same shift, stronger now, no longer subtle. The space itself seemed to adjust, as if the room were acknowledging a presence that no one had dared to name until now. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the tall alpha turned his head in that direction. His expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. The ease from before was gone, replaced by something more controlled, more aware. Around them, others followed, their movements quieter, their attention aligning without discussion. Lillian's breath slowed, though her pulse had begun to rise beneath it, steady but undeniable. She could feel the pull again, stronger now, drawing her awareness toward that far corner whether she allowed it or not. This time, she did not resist it completely. Her gaze lifted, just slightly, enough to see him clearly for the first time. He had stepped out from the deeper shadow, though not fully into the center of the light. It was not hesitation. It was choice. His presence did not require full illumination to be understood. His posture remained composed, almost effortless, yet there was a weight to it now that had not been as visible before. Not force, not aggression. Authority. Quiet. Absolute. The conversations nearest him had faded entirely. No one interrupted him. No one called out. They did not need to. The shift had already happened. Lillian felt it settle into the air, into the space between breaths, into the silence that followed without being asked for. For the first time since she had been called forward, she realized something with startling clarity. The room was no longer watching her. It was waiting on him. And somehow, without understanding how or why, she had become part of that moment. No one announced his arrival, yet the entire room adjusted as if something inevitable had finally stepped into place. Conversations did not stop all at once. They unraveled, thread by thread, until only fragments remained, drifting and fading into the background. Lillian felt it most in the way the air changed, as though the space itself had drawn a breath and chosen to hold it. The man who had stood in the shadows now moved, not quickly, not with any urgency, but with a certainty that required no invitation. Each step was measured, quiet against the polished stone, yet every movement carried further than sound. Alphas who had moments ago filled the room with presence now shifted aside without being asked, their bodies yielding space in a way that was instinctive rather than deliberate. Lillian did not step back. She could not have, even if she wanted to. Her feet remained grounded where she stood, as if the moment itself had fixed her in place. She kept her gaze lowered at first, not out of fear, but because something deeper than habit told her that looking too soon would change something she did not yet understand. The tall alpha beside her straightened, his posture subtly altering, the ease from earlier replaced by a controlled stillness. Respect. Not the performative kind. The real kind. Lillian felt it ripple outward, quiet but undeniable. When she finally lifted her eyes, it was not fully, not directly, but enough to see the man now standing within the circle that had once been used to test her. He did not look at the others. He did not acknowledge the room that had shifted for him. His attention settled, precise and unwavering, on her. The weight of it was different from the others. There was no curiosity in it, no amusement, no need to define or measure. It did not press down on her. It held. Lillian's breath slowed, though her pulse had begun to echo faintly in her chest, steady and present. She had felt the tension before. She had endured it. This was not the same. You, the tall alpha said, his voice carefully neutral now, though it carried a trace of something restrained, something cautious. You did not announce yourself. The words were respectful, but they were also a question. A careful one. The man's gaze did not shift. I was not required to, he replied, his voice low, even, carrying no force and yet leaving no space for disagreement. It was not loud, but it reached every corner of the hall without effort. The response settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place. No one challenged it. No one moved to fill the silence that followed. Lillian felt something inside her tighten, not from fear, but from the realization that whatever this was, it was no longer about her being tested. The rules had shifted. She just did not know how yet. The man took one more step forward, closing the distance between them in a way that felt deliberate but not invasive. Close enough that she could see the details now. The calm set of his expression, the stillness in his posture, the way nothing about him seemed strained or forced. He did not reach for her. He did not speak to her directly. Not yet. But his presence filled the space between them, not as pressure, but as certainty. Around them, the alphas who had once dictated the flow of the evening remained quiet, their attention no longer leading, but following. It was subtle, but it was absolute. Lillian became aware of her own hands again, still folded in front of her, still steady despite everything. She had expected this moment to break her, to push her into something smaller. Instead, it felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, not collapsing, but rearranging in a way she could not yet name. She held the glass without spilling. Someone murmured from the edge of the circle, as if offering a reason, an explanation for what had drawn this attention. It sounded thin even as it was spoken, insufficient. The man's gaze remained on Lillian, unmoved, unchanged, as if that moment had never been the point at all. Lillian swallowed once, the motion small, controlled, before she lifted her chin just slightly, not in defiance, not in challenge, but in acknowledgement of something she could no longer ignore. For the first time, she met his eyes fully. And in that quiet, suspended space, with the entire room held in a silence no one dared break, she understood one thing with sudden, startling clarity. This moment was no longer about surviving their judgment. It was about something else entirely. Something that had not yet revealed itself, but was already unfolding around her. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question did not sound like curiosity. It sounded like a line being drawn. The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet they settled into the space with more weight than any command that had been spoken before. Lillian felt it immediately, the shift in the room tightening once again, but this time not around her as a spectacle, but around the answer she would give. Names mattered here. Names defined rank, history, belonging. And hers had never carried weight. She did not look away. Not this time. "Lillian Hayes," she said, her voice steady, clear enough to reach him without forcing itself into the silence. It was the first time her name had been spoken in that room without being followed by laughter or dismissal. The difference was subtle, but it was there. The man studied her for a moment longer, not reacting, not repeating it, as if the name itself was not what he had been asking for. Around them, the stillness deepened, the kind that pressed gently at the edges of awareness, reminding everyone present that something important was unfolding, even if they could not yet see its shape. "You stood," he said after a moment, his tone unchanged, when stepping back would have been easier. It was not praise. It was not judgment. It was observation. Lillian felt the truth of it settle into her chest before she could decide what to do with it. "There was nowhere else to stand," she replied quietly. The answer came without calculation this time, without weighing how it might be received. It simply existed. For the first time, something in his expression shifted. Not visibly, not enough for others to name, but Lillian saw it. A flicker of something deeper than neutrality. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The tall alpha who had questioned her earlier shifted his weight, the movement small but noticeable in the quiet. She stood because she was told to, he said, his voice careful now, measured in a way it had not been before. It does not mean anything more than that. The words were not meant to challenge directly, but they carried an edge, an attempt to reclaim ground that had begun to slip. The man did not look at him. He did not acknowledge the interruption at all. His attention remained on Lillian, unwavering, as if the rest of the room had become irrelevant. And yet, he said softly, she did not become smaller. The statement settled into the space like a final truth, one that did not require agreement to exist. A ripple moved through the surrounding alphas, not loud, not disruptive, but unmistakable. It was not laughter. It was not approval. It was something closer to unease. Lillian felt it too, though she did not fully understand why. Her fingers tightened briefly against each other before she let them relax again, grounding herself in the only thing she could control, her own stillness. The man took another step, closing the last of the distance between them, though his movement remained measured, respectful in a way that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. He did not tower over her. He did not force her gaze upward. He simply stood within her space, as if inviting the moment to settle rather than claiming it. "Do you know where you stand now, Lillian Hayes?" he asked. The question was different from the ones before. It did not test her place within their hierarchy. It asked something else entirely. Lillian felt the weight of it, the quiet expectation that did not demand an answer, but waited for one all the same. She could feel the room listening again, though no one moved, no one spoke. The earlier tension had not disappeared. It had changed shape. She lifted her chin slightly, her gaze steady, meeting his without hesitation this time. Not because she felt powerful, not because she understood what was happening, but because something inside her refused to retreat. "I stand where I choose to remain," she said. The words were simple, but they carried something new. Not defiance, not submission, something steadier, something rooted. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man inclined his head. Not a bow, not a gesture meant for the room. Something quieter, more personal. And in that small, deliberate motion, the balance of the entire hall shifted once again, this time in a way that no one present could pretend not to feel. The moment his head inclined, something unseen rippled through the hall like a silent command that no one had spoken aloud, yet everyone understood. It was not submission that followed, not immediately, but awareness, sharp, undeniable awareness that what had just occurred did not fit within the rules they had all lived by. Lillian felt it in the way the air tightened again, in the way no one moved too quickly, as if even the smallest misstep might break something fragile that had just been formed. Her pulse had steadied, but it carried a different rhythm now, no longer driven by the need to endure, but by the realization that she was no longer standing alone within their judgment. The tall alpha who had challenged her earlier shifted again, this time more noticeably, his control slipping just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "You honor her," he said carefully, each word placed with precision, for composure. "That is generous." The statement was measured, but it carried an undercurrent, a quiet resistance wrapped in politeness. Lillian did not move, but she felt the shift in attention, the way the room leaned subtly toward the response that would follow. The man beside her did not look at the speaker. He did not need to. "I do not offer generosity," he said, his tone even, unhurried. "I acknowledge what is present." The distinction settled heavily, leaving no space for reinterpretation. A few alphas lowered their gazes, not dramatically, not in open submission, but enough that the change was visible to anyone paying attention. Lillian felt it again, that quiet rearranging of the room, the way authority was no longer being displayed, but recognized. It was different, more absolute. "And what is present?" another voice asked, this one from farther back, less confrontational, more cautious, as if testing the edges of something they did not yet understand. For the first time since he had stepped forward, the man's gaze shifted, not fully away from Lillian, but enough to acknowledge the question without releasing her from his focus. "Restraint," he said. "Clarity. And choice." The words were simple, but they carried farther than any raised voice could have. Lillian felt them settle into her, not as praise, but as something heavier, something that pressed gently against everything she had been told she was not allowed to be. Choice. The word lingered longer than the others. It did not belong to her world. Not like this. Not here. The tall alpha exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening for just a fraction of a second before smoothing again. Those are not qualities that change rank, he said. It was not a challenge. It was a reminder, or perhaps a warning. The man beside Lillian was quiet for a moment, not because he lacked an answer, but because he did not rush to give one. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but it carried even more weight than before. Rank is what you assign, he said. Worth is what remains. The distinction landed differently. It did not push. It did not demand agreement. It simply existed, undeniable once spoken. Lillian felt something inside her shift in response, something she had kept buried beneath years of learning where she was supposed to belong. Around them, the room did not erupt. There was no sudden reaction, no dramatic display. Instead, there was a quiet recalibration, as if every person present was adjusting their understanding in real time, whether they wished to or not. The man turned back to her fully now, his attention returning with that same quiet intensity that had never once wavered. You stood without asking permission, he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her, though it still carried through the silence. Do you understand what that means? Lillian felt the question settle deeper than the others had. It was not testing her place. It was asking if she saw what had changed. She drew in a slow breath, her fingers loosening slightly as she let the tension leave them, grounding herself in the moment as it unfolded rather than trying to control it. It means I did not leave, she answered, her voice quiet but certain. He studied her for a moment longer, and this time, there was no mistaking the shift in his expression. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who was not looking for it, but Lillian saw it clearly. Approval. Not given lightly. Not offered for show. Something real. Around them, the silence deepened once more, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning. Waiting. Because now, whether anyone had spoken it or not, the room understood that what came next would not return things to the way they had been before. Then show them. A voice said from the far side of the hall, quieter than the others, yet carrying enough weight to disturb the fragile stillness that had settled. It was not spoken with authority, not openly, but it carried something sharper, uncertainty disguised as challenge. The room shifted again, not breaking, but tightening, as if every presence within it was adjusting to a new tension that had not yet been resolved. Lillian felt it immediately, the subtle pull of expectation returning, though it was no longer directed at her alone. It moved between her and the man beside her, circling them both, searching for something to confirm, something to anchor what had already begun to unravel. She did not move, not because she was certain, but because she understood now that movement would not restore what had been. The tall alpha exhaled slowly, his composure returning piece by piece, though it did not settle as easily as before. Words are easily spoken, he said, his tone measured, careful not to cross a line he could no longer clearly see. Recognition requires more than observation. It was not a direct challenge, but it was not acceptance either. The distinction interrupted. Even the faint sounds of shifting fabric and glass had faded, leaving only the soft, steady rhythm of breath and presence. Lillian's fingers loosened at her sides, the tension she had carried for so long no longer tightening against her control. Slowly, without breaking the moment, she lifted her hand. Not quickly, not hesitantly, simply steadily. Her fingers moved into the space his hand had created, stopping just before contact, mirroring the distance he had left. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The space between their hands remained, charged not with force, but with something quieter, something deeper than the rules that had governed everything before. Then, gently, their hands met. The contact was light, almost imperceptible, yet the effect was immediate. Not outwardly. The room did not erupt. No one spoke. But something shifted again, deeper this time, beyond posture or gaze. Lillian felt it like a current beneath still water, steady and undeniable. The man did not tighten his hold. He did not pull her closer. He simply allowed the contact to exist, as if that alone was enough to confirm what words had not yet declared. Around them, the silence held, no longer uncertain, no longer questioning. It had become something else entirely. Recognition. And in that quiet, unbroken moment, every person in the hall understood, even without explanation, that whatever came next would not be undone. No one spoke when their hands touched, yet the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was charged, deliberate, as if the entire hall had recognized something that did not need to be explained aloud. Lillian felt it in the way her breath slowed, not from effort, but from a strange, steady clarity that settled beneath her ribs. The contact between them remained light, unforced, yet it carried a certainty she had never experienced before. It did not demand anything from her. It did not take. It simply existed, undeniable in its presence. Around them, the alphas who had once filled the space with their authority stood still, their attention no longer sharp with judgment, but drawn into something they could not easily define. The tall alpha who had questioned her earlier shifted again, though this time the movement was restrained, almost cautious. "This changes nothing," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence it once held. The words were offered as a boundary, a final attempt to anchor the room to rules that had already begun to fracture. Lillian felt the statement pass through the space, but it did not settle the way it was meant to. It did not hold. The man beside her did not release her hand. He did not tighten his hold either. Instead, he turned his gaze slowly toward the speaker, the movement subtle but precise. It was the first time he had fully acknowledged anyone else since stepping forward. The shift was immediate. The room reacted without sound, the tension realigning itself around his attention. "It changes everything," he said. The words were not raised. They did not need to be. They settled into the hall with a quiet finality that left no room for argument. The tall alpha held his ground for a moment longer, his expression controlled, but something behind it faltered, just slightly. Not fear. Not yet. But recognition that the balance he had relied on was no longer his to define. Lillian felt it then, more clearly than before, the difference between influence and authority. One asked to be accepted, the other simply was. The man's gaze returned to her, not dismissing the others, but placing them outside the moment entirely. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low, meant only for her, though the silence carried it farther than intended. Lillian did not answer immediately, not because she did not understand, but because what she felt did not have a name she had ever been allowed to use. It was not power. It was not rank. It was something quieter, something rooted, like standing on solid ground after believing for years that it would give way beneath her. She drew in a slow breath, her fingers still resting against his, steady now in a way they had never been before. "Yes," she said softly. It was a simple answer, but it was enough. Around them, the silence deepened once more, no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It had become something else entirely. Acceptance, not spoken, but understood. The man's hand shifted slightly, not pulling her closer, not guiding her, but adjusting just enough to make the contact unmistakable, visible to everyone watching. Not hidden, not subtle. A statement, though no words were added to it. Lillian felt the weight of that shift, the quiet transition from something private to something undeniable. The room saw it, and this time, no one laughed. No one questioned. The earlier voices, the ones that had filled the hall with casual dismissal, had faded into something distant, irrelevant. The tall alpha lowered his gaze, just slightly, the movement small but impossible to ignore. Others followed, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough that the pattern became clear. Respect, no longer optional. Lillian felt it ripple outward, not directed at her in the way she had always imagined, but extending through her, tied to the moment she now stood within. She had not asked for this. She had not reached for it. And yet, it had found her all the same. The man beside her did not look away. His attention remained steady, grounded, as if nothing in the room could alter what had already been decided. "Stand," he said quietly. It was not a command. It was not a correction. It was recognition of what she was already doing. Lillian's shoulders settled, the last of the tension leaving them as she straightened fully, not adjusting to fit the room, but allowing the room to adjust around her. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing in a place that did not belong to her. She felt exactly where she was meant to be. Around them, The hall remained silent, held in that same unbroken stillness. Because now, whether anyone had spoken it aloud or not, there was no denying what had just occurred. The rules had changed, and they would not be returning to what they had been before. The silence did not break when he spoke again. It deepened, as if the room itself understood that what followed would not be questioned. "You have spent your lives measuring worth by rank," he said, his voice calm, unhurried, yet carrying through the hall with absolute clarity. "And still, you failed to see what stood in front of you." No one interrupted him. No one dared. The earlier voices, the ones that had once filled the space with certainty, had vanished completely, leaving only a stillness that felt deliberate, chosen. Lillian felt the weight of his words settle into the room, not directed at her, but reshaping everything around her. His hand remained lightly against hers, not holding, not restraining, but anchoring the moment in something real. The tall alpha straightened again, though the motion lacked its earlier confidence. "She is an omega," he said, carefully, as if stating a fact might restore order. "That does not change." The statement lingered, offered as something solid, something unmovable, but it no longer carried the same certainty it once had. The man beside Lillian turned his head slightly, not sharply, not with force, but with enough presence that the words dissolved before they could take root. "It changes nothing," he repeated softly, "and yet you built everything around it." The distinction settled heavily, leaving no space for denial. A quiet shift moved through the room again, more visible this time. Some alphas lowered their gazes fully now. Others remained still, but their posture had changed, the tension in their shoulders no longer directed outward, but inward, contained. Lillian felt it ripple outward from where she stood, the quiet collapse of something that had once seemed absolute. He took a step forward, drawing her with him, not pulling, not forcing, but guiding the moment into the center of the hall where she had first been called to stand. This time, the space did not feel like a stage. It felt like a threshold. The chandeliers above cast their light more directly now, illuminating both of them clearly, leaving no shadows to soften what was being seen. Lillian did not resist the movement. Her steps followed naturally, steady, grounded in a way she had never felt before. The room parted without instruction, the path opening as if it had always been meant to exist. When they reached the center, he stopped. The silence held. Then, slowly, he released her hand, not to create distance, but to make what came next unmistakable. His hand lifted, not toward her this time, but outward, toward the gathered alphas who stood watching, waiting, no longer certain of where they belonged within this moment. "You placed her beneath you," he said, his voice even, each word deliberate. "You measured her by what she was told to be." No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of his words did not allow it. Then his gaze shifted, returning to her, steady, unwavering. And when he spoke again, the entire room seemed to still even further, as if the world itself had narrowed to the space between his voice and her presence. "I measure her by what she chose to be." The words did not rise. They did not need to. They settled into the hall with a finality that left no room for interpretation. Lillian felt something inside her shift, not sharply, not suddenly, but completely. As if a door she had never known existed had opened without warning, revealing something she had never been allowed to see. Around them, the alphas stood frozen in place, their silence no longer uncertain, but absolute. Because now, whether they accepted it or not, the balance had been rewritten. The man took one final step, positioning himself not above her, not in front of her, but beside her, equal in stance, aligned in a way that no one in the room could ignore. His presence did not overshadow hers. It reinforced it. Then, with the same quiet certainty that had shaped every word he had spoken, he looked out across the hall and said, "From this moment forward, you will not place her below you again." It was not a request. It was not a warning. It was a declaration. And in the stillness that followed, no one questioned it. Because they understood, even without being told, that this was no longer about one omega standing in a room full of alphas. This was about a truth they had failed to recognize and could no longer deny. No one moved after his words settled into the hall. It was not hesitation. It was not confusion. It was something deeper, an instinctive understanding that the moment had crossed a line that could not be stepped back from. Lillian stood beside him, her posture steady, her breathing even, yet everything within her felt newly aligned, as if the ground beneath her had finally settled into something solid after years of uncertainty. She did not look down. She did not shrink. Not anymore. Around them, the alphas who had once filled the room with quiet dominance now stood in a different kind of stillness, one shaped not by control, but by awareness. The tall alpha, the one who had questioned her first, remained where he was, his expression carefully composed, though the tension in his jaw betrayed the shift he could no longer ignore. "And what is she to you?" he asked, the question measured, but no longer edged with challenge. It was something else now, a need to understand where the new boundary had been drawn. The man beside Lillian did not answer immediately. He allowed the silence to hold, to stretch just long enough that the weight of the question settled fully into the space between them. Then he turned slightly, not away from Lillian, but toward the room, as if the answer was not meant for one voice, but for all of them. "She is not what you decided she would be," he said. His tone remained calm, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something that did not need to rise in volume to command attention. "And she is not defined by what you failed to see." The words carried, firm and undeniable, yet still controlled, never breaking the quiet authority that had shaped every moment since he stepped forward. Lillian felt the impact of them in a way she could not fully describe, as if each word loosened something that had been held tightly inside her for years. She had spent so long learning how to fit into the space others allowed her, how to make herself smaller to avoid being seen as something out of place. And now, standing here, she realized that space had never been hers to accept. It had only ever been theirs to impose. The tall alpha lowered his gaze slightly, not fully, but enough that the shift could not be mistaken. It was not submission, not entirely, but it was acknowledgement. Others followed, some more quickly than others, the movement spreading through the room in quiet waves. No one announced it. No one commanded it. It simply happened, as naturally as breath. Lillian felt it ripple, outward, not directed at her as a person, but at what she now represented within this moment. A change, a correction, a truth that could no longer be ignored. The man beside her turned back to her then, his attention returning fully, as if the rest of the room had already been addressed. His gaze held hers, steady and certain, and for the first time, Lillian did not feel the need to question what she saw there. "Do you understand what they see now?" he asked quietly. The question was not testing her. It was grounding her, anchoring her within the shift that had already taken place. Lillian drew in a slow breath, her shoulders relaxing fully as she let the last remnants of tension leave her. She did not look around the room. She did not need to. She could feel it in the way the space had changed, in the way the weight that had once pressed down on her had lifted and settled somewhere else entirely. "They see what was always there," she said, her voice calm, clear, no longer restrained by the need to be careful. The answer lingered, not because it was surprising, but because it was true. And truth, once spoken, did not require repetition. For a moment, the man said nothing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he inclined his head again, not as acknowledgement of her answer, but as recognition of her understanding. Around them, the room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of acceptance, of something recognized and settled into place. Lillian stood beside him, no longer at the edge, no longer defined by where she had been told to stand. And for the first time, she did not feel like she had been brought into the center of the room. She felt like the room had shifted to meet her where she already was. The silence did not dissolve when her words settled into the room. It deepened, becoming something steady, something rooted, as if every presence within the hall had reached the same unspoken understanding at the same time. Lillian remained where she stood, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even, no longer measuring herself against the space around her. The weight that had once pressed against her chest had lifted, completely, replaced by something quieter, something certain. She did not need to look around to know what had changed. She could feel it in the way the room held itself, in the way no one moved without purpose, in the way attention no longer searched for weakness, but acknowledged presence. The man beside her shifted slightly, not to step away, but to turn fully toward the gathered alphas, his posture unchanged, his presence still carrying that same quiet authority that had reshaped everything without force. "You built your order on what could be seen," he said, his voice calm, steady, yet carrying through the hall with unmistakable clarity. "Strength, rank, position." Each word settled into the space, not as criticism, but as truth laid bare. No one interrupted him. No one corrected him. They could not. He let the silence hold for a moment, allowing the weight of it to settle fully before continuing. "And yet," he added, his gaze moving slowly across the room, "you overlooked what does not need to be displayed to exist." The distinction lingered, pressing gently against everything they had relied on, everything they had believed to be absolute. Lillian felt the meaning of it unfold within her, not as something new, but as something she had always known, buried beneath years of being told otherwise. She had never lacked worth. She had only been placed in a space that refused to recognize it. The tall alpha lowered his head further this time, not fully, not completely, but enough that the shift could not be mistaken. Others followed, more clearly now, the movement no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. It was not submission. It was acknowledgement, and it spread, quietly, steadily, until it became the new shape of the room. Lillian stood within it, not elevated above them in a way that separated her, but aligned in a way that no longer diminished her. The man beside her turned back to her then, his attention grounding the moment once more. "What they see now will not disappear," he said, his voice lower, meant only for her, though it still carried through the stillness. "But what you choose to do with it will define what follows." The words were not a command. They were not instruction. They were recognition of her agency, something no one in that room had ever offered her before. Lillian felt it settle within her, not as pressure, but as possibility. She did not rush to answer. She did not need to. Instead, she drew in a slow breath, letting the moment exist fully before stepping forward. Just one step, not away from him, not toward anyone else, simply forward, into the space that had once been used to diminish her. This time, the movement was not watched with amusement or expectation. It was observed with quiet respect. She lifted her gaze, not searching, not avoiding, but meeting the room as it now stood before her. "I will stand as I am," she said, her voice clear, steady, no longer softened by restraint. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled, firm and undeniable, carried not by volume, but by certainty. The man beside her inclined his head once more, the gesture small, but filled with recognition. Around them, the room remained still, but it was no longer waiting. It had accepted what had already taken place. The structure that had once defined everything had not shattered. It had shifted, reshaped into something that could no longer ignore what stood before it. Lillian felt it fully now, not as a sudden transformation, but as a quiet truth that had always existed, now finally seen. And as she stood there, no longer at the edge, no longer unseen, she understood something with absolute clarity. This was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of everything that would come after. No one spoke after her words settled, yet the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was clear, almost weightless, as if something that had long been held in place had finally been released. Lillian remained standing at the center of the hall, not as someone placed there, not as someone tested, but as someone who simply belonged. The difference was subtle to the eye, but undeniable in the air. Around her, the alphas did not shift with discomfort anymore. They stood with a quiet awareness, their earlier certainty replaced by something more grounded, more honest. The man beside her remained still, his presence unchanged, yet no longer needed to shape the moment. It had already taken form. For a brief second, nothing moved. Then, slowly, one alpha inclined his head. It was not dramatic. It was not announced. But it was deliberate. Another followed. Then another. Not all at once. Not in perfect unison, but steadily, until the gesture spread through the room like a quiet understanding that required no command. Lillian felt it, not as something placed upon her, but as something that acknowledged what had always been there. Respect, no longer withheld. Not given out of obligation, but because it could no longer be denied. She did not react outwardly. She did not step forward again. She simply stood, her posture relaxed, her gaze steady, allowing the moment to exist without trying to control it. The man beside her turned his head slightly, his eyes moving across the room as if confirming what had already been said into motion. Then, for the first time since he had stepped forward, his focus softened. Not weakened, not diminished, but no longer carrying the weight of needing to hold the room in place. It no longer required him. "Remember this," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest, though it seemed to echo further than it should. "Not because I told you to see it, but because you did not see it when it was right in front of you." The words did not linger as a warning. They settled as a truth that would not fade with time. Lillian felt them as well, not as something directed outward, but as something that anchored her within the moment she had stepped into. She had not changed who she was. She had not become something new. She had simply stopped stepping back. And that had been enough. The chandeliers above flickered slightly as a draft moved through the hall, the light shifting just enough to cast new angles across the polished floor. The room felt different now. Not louder, not softer, just settled, as if it had adjusted itself around a truth it could no longer ignore. Lillian let her gaze move, not searching, not cautious, but open, taking in the faces that had once looked through her, past her, beyond her. Now, they met her eyes. Not all of them held warmth. Not all of them held acceptance. But none of them dismissed her. That alone was enough. The man beside her took a small step back, not retreating, but giving the moment space to stand on its own. He did not need to remain at the center of it anymore. It no longer belonged to him. It belonged to what had been revealed. Lillian felt the shift as he moved, but she did not follow. She remained where she was, grounded, steady, exactly as she had said she would be. For a long moment, the hall remained still, held in that quiet balance where nothing needed to be forced. Then, gradually, movement returned. Not as it had before. Not careless. Not dismissive. But measured. A conversation resumed, softer this time. Glass touched glass again, but without the edge it had carried earlier. The room had not returned to what it was. It had moved forward into something else. Lillian drew in a slow breath, letting it out just as steadily, her shoulders easing fully as the last trace of tension left her body. She did not need to prove anything else. She did not need to hold anything together. It was already done. As she stood there, no longer unseen, no longer defined by where she had been placed, she understood something with quiet certainty. Power could command attention. It could demand obedience. But what had happened here had not been commanded. It had been recognized. And recognition, once given, could not be taken back. Somewhere near the edge of the hall, a voice spoke softly, almost to itself, though it carried just enough to be heard. She did not rise, it said. We were the ones who finally saw where she already stood. And this time, no one laughed.